Hello students, this module deals with the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution was one of the three events that was responsible for the birth of sociology. The other two events were the Enlightenment and the French Revolution. Many sociologists have argued that, like Randall Collins, that sociology's rise should be traced also to an earlier event like the Renaissance. But for the time being, we will be focusing on the three events on which there is a large consensus over the emergence of sociology. Industrial Revolution, as one of the events that contributed to the development of our discipline of sociology in the 19th century, was based on some of the scientific and technological innovations, including the scientific revolution of its preceding centuries. It began in the 18th century and continued till the 19th, and indeed, the Industrial Revolution never seemed to have an end. We keep on having many forms of industrial revolutions, let's say, since the 18th century. Some of the events, some of the factors, let us say, that caused the industrial revolutions could be noted down as wealth that came through geographical discoveries, through trade, and of course, colonialism. There was the emergence of a partial cash economy. There was already an existing manufacturing system that we all know of. We would have studied about the guilds, about the trade associations prior to the Industrial Revolution. So that kind of manufacturing system had existed in Europe. And wealth in pre-industrial Europe was in the form of an immense accumulation of commodities. There was opulent consumption in towns, and there was wide range and quality of goods manufactured before the factory system emerged, and there was extensive inland trade. Now, what was pre-industrial Europe like? Particularly, we would be concerned with the town, the city, the condition of labor, and all this. So, pre-industrial Europe had, in terms of employment, underemployment. That was the normal condition of labor in both the towns and the countryside. There was irregularity of work, and therefore, out of these, so underemployment and irregularity of work, there emerged indebtedness. And indebtedness was, again, another normal feature. There was, of course, because of irregularity of work, and because of underemployment as well, a casual attitude to work. So leisure was preferred to work. If some of us have studied the Protestant ethic and the spirit of Calvinism from Weber, we would know that Calvin had considered this kind of laziness, so leisure and laziness, as one of the sins against God. In pre-industrial manufacture, workers, and this is an important point, workers had a share in the product of their labor. And payments were made mostly in kind. And there were, of course, the idea of customary payments. Now, this was broadly the features of European society prior to the Industrial Revolution. Now, there is a debate, and this is a debate that had been taken up by Pat Hudson, because there are new social scientists who have argued that the Industrial Revolution, about which we have read and which we considered to be one of those earth-shattering events, was less dramatic than it has been made out to be. Whatever be the case, and that there were certain elements of pre-industrial European manufacturing system and pre-industrial European society that were carried over into the industrial capital and manufacturing. So that's the factory system. Even if we agree to that, and which was, of course, a fact, we would still see that the Industrial Revolution somehow had managed to be that dramatic event that had given rise to a lot of social commentary, writings, so writers, thinkers, social commentators, both conservative and radical, who would be for the old order and the radical ones who would be for change. They were, in certain measure, very much impacted by the Industrial Revolution and what it did to the social fabric. Broadly basing our lecture on Robert Nisbet's book, The Sociological Tradition, and we would be drawing in a bit from Engels, of course, The Condition of the Working Class in England, and Eric Hobsbawm's introduction to Engels, and we had already referred to Pat Hudson. We would identify 5 areas that evoked passionate commentary, indictment, enthusiasm. Those were labor, property, city, that's the industrial city and urbanism, the factory system, and technology. For the first time, we have the emergence of a working class in the form of proletariats. So there occurred a proletarianization. What was it? So even the small peasants. So the serfs were liberated. They became workers. We have small peasants uprooted from their lands. We have a section of the aristocracy that could not keep up with the pace of industrialization, who joined the ranks of laborers. So this kind of a proletariat or the industrial working class was historically an unprecedented emergence. What happened with that? What do we see? If we recall a film, I think all of us would have seen that, and perhaps many times, Charlie Chaplin's Modern Times. There was a scene, and if you could recall that. So when the factories reopened and Chaplin learnt about it, he rushed to get employment. And you would see that what Chaplin portrayed in that was the gates were opened and men were, and I use, flocking in. Human beings, mostly men, they were flocking in. And this flocking in of men were, for a few seconds, replaced by the flocking in of sheep. So basically, one would say that the conditions of work were such that an industrial laborer or the worker could very easily identified with animals like sheep, going to perhaps the slaughterhouse. It meant one thing: degradation of labor. So labor was turned into a mere commodity, uprooted from, and this is where the conservatives were fundamental in their critique, that they were uprooted from the protective contexts of the guild, the protective contexts of the village, the protective contexts of family and community, and thrown into the industrial urban labor market. Dehumanization of labor, dehumanization of human beings, of the worker to the machine. So, what did it bring about? It brought about instability. In what ways? Industry and industrial capital had, and this is something that Engels had pointed out, centralizing tendency. And we would see in the writings of Marx and Engels where the big capitalist would eat up the smaller ones. How? Take over the manufacturing and the industries of the smaller capitalists and turn into a bigger one. Okay? So the centralizing tendency occurred along with the centralization of population. So more and more people would come together to work in the industry. We have what we learn in Marx, the extraction of surplus value. That is how laborers are exploited behind their back, although they are paid the wages that was determined by the market. However, there were falling wage rates and rising profits, which led to impoverishment of large sections of society. A primary concern around this degradation of labor for both radicals and conservatives have been their alienation. So we know that Marx had identified 4 types of alienation. It's alienation of the laborer from the product, alienation of the laborer from the process of production, alienation of laborer from one's own self, and from fellow laborers and the community in general. However, Marx is tied, let us keep this in mind, not merely to the factory system or technology, but alienation was tied for Marx to private property. This is something we will have to keep in mind when we make a distinction between the critique of radicals like Marx and those of the conservatives. For them, for the conservatives, this kind of alienation emerged from this rootlessness of the worker. The worker was rooted and protected by traditional customs and institutions. But this uprooting of the worker from those secure, protective contexts had created an alienated labor force. Related to the condition of labor is factory system and technology. They are all tied together. What they did was, what did the factory system and technology do? It unleashed human productivity massively, and it also thereby threatened the traditional social fabric. Why? Because human productivity was restrained both by nature and by the traditional fabric. But technology simply released that potential. All those restraining factors, it just denounced and brought in a very disciplined manner, through factory discipline, the rise of productivity. And therefore, it was seen as against nature by the conservatives and against the traditional social fabric. It also changed gender relations. Before Industrial Revolution, when there was household production, women and children would be equally part of the production process. But what we now know as masculinity and femininity are understandings of the role of the male breadwinner and the female housekeeper taking care of the household, of the domestic sphere, is actually a creation of the Industrial Revolution, of the factory system. It did not exist for an eternity. For time immemorial. So these led to changed gender relations where men were identified with work as producers and women with the reproductive sphere, not only biological reproduction but also social reproduction, where women would be taking care of the domestic sphere to ensure the reproduction of the worker the next day for the capitalist. Extended families started breaking up earlier, but it broke up faster under the pace of the revolution. For the conservatives, the Industrial Revolution, its factory system and technology, threatened to abolish the distinction between the town and the countryside, and we'll come to that in the next topic, in our next concern on the city. There was, of course, what we discussed earlier as enslavement of workers to the machine and the dehumanization of labor. Now, however, unlike conservatives, the radicals did find in technology progress and the ability to free humans from the shackles of tradition and nature. But for conservatives, the factory system represented economic regimentation that was to be found only in prisons and the barracks. To this is related our concern over the city, and we would see that the city had been at the center of sociological concerns from its emergence. So city was the theme for the concerns of disorganization, of alienation, of mental isolation, and we could think of so many sociologists from Ferdinand Tönnies to Emil Durkheim, Max Weber to Marx. For Marx, however, despite these disorganizations and all, urbanism was a blessing. And radical thought specifically had an urban character. They believed that the city could lead to progress and freedom of humans from traditional society. Indeed, Marx did not have great things to say about ruralism, yet he still underscored the problem of labor in industrial revolution. From Engels we get a better picture of the underside of urbanism. In his book, The Condition of the Working Class in England, where he focuses on the industrial towns, that it was a crowded industrial city. All such cities were like that. And that the city created isolated, selfish individuals. It created anonymity, isolation, and self-centered pursuits, where humans would forget their bonds to community and society. The way he describes the cities and dwellings of workers, it's pathetic, unhygienic, hardly any sanitation, and it's a very pitiable kind of condition in which the workers lived. He saw in the city, in this kind of dwelling places, not only the city, not the city as such, but the dwelling places that existed in the city of industrial capitalism, the dissolution of humankind. That how could humans live in these kinds of conditions? For conservatives, urbanism and factory had destroyed the very fabric of European life and culture. Transformation of property. The full-fledged introduction of a cash economy, the birth of shares instead of landed property, and the market had shaken the traditional order that was based on landed property. And conservatives were absolutely angry because of the disintegration of landed property. On that was landed property was the basis of power for the ruling elites, the traditional elites and the conservatives. Edmund Burke made that very significant commentary on this, that what did shares, the industrial shares, company shares, what did they do? They did away with allegiance and stability. Landed property was up for sale for anyone who could afford it. So therefore, what happened to status that was dependent on landed property? Everything, therefore, seemed to just be washed away by the forces of the Industrial Revolution. Our last part, that is, how could we tie up Industrial Revolution with the birth of sociology? How did sociology emerge from the Industrial Revolution as one of the events, not only from the Industrial Revolution, but the Industrial Revolution being one of the events that led to the emergence of this discipline? How would we link Industrial Revolution with sociology? What were the concerns? Industrial society. The dissolution of the old traditional community and the emergence of a more individualistic industrial society. Alienation, about which we have already spoken. Class conflict. And the question of solidarity. What happened to solidarity? We would see Durkheim trying to find out the basis of a new social order, of a new form of solidarity, and thereby trying to bring together that question that had haunted us, the individual versus society. That has been a feature of Enlightenment thought, that tension. And that tension was remarkably revealed also in classical sociological thought, and even now that tension exists. How do we get that community or that feeling back? Anomie or normlessness. And we find the best expression of it in Durkheim's theory of suicide, where he identifies a particular type of suicide, anomic suicide, with modern industrial society. The question of status had bothered sociologists. Rationalization, let us say, and we would recall Max Weber, who focused on this, whose thesis was on rationalization that had led to disenchantment. Rationalization that had created creatures who would be mere routine workers, following routine, lack of creativity, and which also gave rise to questions of authority. Authority which was based in tradition came now to be based on rational, impersonal rules and principles. By way of conclusion, now we can say that the works of the 19th century or classical sociologists were directly concerned with the themes that were at the heart of discussion around the Industrial Revolution of the 18th century England. We find questions of alienation, of class conflict in the works of Marx and Engels. Saint-Simon and Comte's work on positive or scientific industrial society is based on an informed critique of the industrial order. The work of Durkheim revolves around the question of solidarity based on a secular order. His first book, The Division of Labor in Society, squarely addresses the problem of order and solidarity that were thrown up by the disruptive events of the Industrial Revolution, the problem of alienation and anomie, and the question of social justice. As we have already said, in his work on suicide, Durkheim devotes a large amount of space to the analysis of a type of suicide that is distinctly related to the industrial order. That is one that indeed flows from that order, called anomic suicide. Weber's theme of rationalization and disenchantment is also related to the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution. And finally, let us say, Zimmel's work on the philosophy of money and the metropolis and mentality are responses to the issues opened up by the Industrial Revolution. Thank you.